I first heard about the place from an old travel brochure I found in my university library, something that promised scenic overlooks and mysterious legends in equal measure. The Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore in Michigan's Upper Peninsula practically leapt off the page at me. Photographs of towering cliffs lit gold by the sun, turquoise waters lapping at sandstone, dense forests teeming with wildlife. It all felt alive, a place that had existed in my imagination long before I realized it was real. I couldn't stop picturing myself there, capturing it on my camera and in my travel journals. I mentioned it offhand to Liam O'Neill, my longtime friend who was always seeking the next thrill, and before I knew it, he was planning the entire trip. Liam's enthusiasm tends to be contagious. He's fearless in the way I've never quite managed to be. When he jumped on the idea, he texted our small group chat, announcing that we were officially headed to the Upper Peninsula in late spring, right when the weather would be mild, but before the crowds descended. I remember reading that message with a growing sense of excitement and dread all at once. Pictured Rocks was supposed to be gorgeous, yes, but there were also rumors about how remote and challenging some of the trails could be if we strayed from the designated sites. By the time I mentioned those concerns, he had roped in the others, and it was settled. Our band of 5, Liam, myself, Ava Brooks, Marcus, whom we always called Marty, Jefferson, and Tommy Hall, would drive north at dawn on a bright Thursday, giving ourselves 4 days to camp, explore, and decompress from life. We loaded up Liam's SUV with tents, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last a small army. The others teased me about my stash of blank journals, pencils, and the small watercolor set I sometimes used for field sketches. They all knew how I liked to document every trip, every fleeting moment of wonder or strangeness that caught my eye. In truth, I think that was my way of feeling safe. If I could record the world around me in meticulous detail, then I had some measure of control over it. We didn't talk much on the drive up. With the early morning sun streaming through the windows, we dozed off in shifts, content to let the sound of the tires on the highway fill the silence. Liam drove like a man possessed, determined to reach the Upper Peninsula before nightfall. Sitting up front with him, I noticed how the landscape changed the further north we went. The fields gave way to thick stands of pine and birch, and the air felt cleaner, crisper. By the time we reached Munising, the closest town of note near Pictured Rocks, the sun was beginning to set. We stopped for supplies, extra water, some fresh produce, more bug spray than I'd ever seen in my life, then drove deeper into the wilderness. It was nearly twilight when we found a suitable spot near the Chapel Loop Trail, a popular route that takes hikers past waterfalls, rock formations, and the forested shoreline of Lake Superior. But we didn't plan on stopping at the usual campground. According to the limited research Liam and Ava had done, there were a few lesser-known campsites that could be reached if you took a side trail. We wanted a little privacy, a place to pitch our tents that felt removed from the regular bustle of hikers. Ava insisted on double-checking our route with a borrowed compass. She's the calm, rational one in our group, the one who always keeps us grounded in reality. Her mouth twisted in confusion as the compass needle wavered strangely, before eventually settling in a direction that seemed to deviate from the posted trail signs. With the last slivers of daylight against our backs, we decided to trust the signage over the fickle compass. Marty joked that maybe the magnetic fields of the area were all messed up because of some secret government experiment. We all laughed at that. He's our resident clown, quick to diffuse tension with a well-placed joke. But there was an uneasy undercurrent in the air. Even that first night, I remember the cold was sharper than I expected, and an odd hush blanketed the forest. We hiked in for about half an hour under the deepening gray sky, the tall pines looming overhead. Finally, we found a small clearing, barely large enough for 2 tents, let alone 3. We decided to pitch them in close proximity. One for Liam and Marty, one for Ava and me, and one for Tommy, who preferred to sleep alone because he said it helped him manage his thoughts. Tommy was the quiet soul of the group, introspective, sometimes nervous about unknown forces, and with a soft spot for local lore. He was the only one who had browsed strange historical accounts of the area before we set out. While we set up the tents, he casually brought up stories of missing explorers near Lake Superior, of Native American legends about spirits that roamed the shoreline, of rumors that from time to time, something like a Wendigo would appear in these northern woods. We laughed uneasily, brushing it off as typical campfire story fodder. Little did we know what we were stepping into. We managed to light a small campfire that first night to warm ourselves and cook dinner. The conversation was lively enough, discussing which trails to explore, how best to get spectacular photos of the famous rock formations, and whether or not we'd catch a glimpse of the northern lights if the sky stayed clear. But underlying all that excitement was an odd tension. It's difficult to describe, but the forest around us felt so silent, not silent in a peaceful way. Rather, it felt like it was holding its breath. Occasionally, we'd hear the soft crash of waves in the distance, or the rustle of leaves if a gust of wind passed. But there were no usual night creatures, no crickets or frogs or owls. When Marty commented on that, we all paused to listen, exchanging looks. It was true. The forest seemed empty, devoid of the chorus that typically accompanies nightfall. I busied myself writing in my journal, describing the environment, my friends' reactions, the dryness in the air that tasted faintly of pine needles. Ava teased me about always scribbling away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stopped paying attention, something would slip past my awareness. That sense of dread became more tangible around midnight. Liam stood up, shining his flashlight into the surrounding trees, insisting he heard some kind of whisper. We listened, but heard nothing. Then he shrugged, presumably deciding he was just tired. Everyone turned in for the night, though none of us slept easily. I was drifting in and out of a restless doze when I heard it, a faint, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to breeze past our tent. For a few moments, I questioned whether I was imagining things. My eyes flicked open. Ava was beside me, fast asleep, her breathing steady. I couldn't discern words, only a gentle hiss that sounded like a voice carried on the wind. It felt close, too close. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I wanted to wake Ava, but didn't want to alarm her with something that might be a figment of my imagination. Instead, I peered at the tent fabric, half expecting to see a shadow pass by. Nothing. I listened, breath held, but the whisper didn't come again. At dawn, the forest suddenly felt more ordinary. Birds chirped, squirrels darted across fallen logs. I stepped outside and warmed my hands on a tin of coffee Liam had prepared. Everyone was moving slowly, as though we hadn't quite shaken off our nightmares. Marty eventually broke the silence with a forced laugh, making a light-hearted complaint about the cold. That was all it took for our group dynamic to snap back, at least superficially. We talked ourselves into positivity. Today was the day we'd do the Chapel Loop Trail, see the famous Chapel Falls, maybe even make it around to Chapel Rock. The sun was climbing, golden light filtering through the canopy, and the pines smelled fresh. We strapped on our day packs and set off down the trail, leaving the tents behind. The main trail was well marked, and we soon encountered other hikers who greeted us amiably, remarking on the stunning views we were all sure to see if we kept going. For a while, the strangeness of the night before faded into memory, replaced by that sense of shared excitement people feel when they're out in nature. We took pictures at scenic overlooks, gazed in awe at the rock formations carved out by centuries of wind and water, and listened to water cascading at Chapel Falls. The day wore on beautifully. Tommy lingered behind at times to study unusual carvings on trees, or to remark on how certain stones looked like they might have been arranged intentionally, maybe by early inhabitants or by nature itself. He seemed both fascinated and wary. I found it charming, though. That childlike curiosity in him often brought interesting discoveries. It was late afternoon when things started turning strange again. We'd decided to head back to our campsite without retracing our exact steps. Liam had found what looked like an alternate path on the map. Ava checked the compass again, only to find that the needle spun before pointing in a nonsensical direction. She tapped on the face, frustrated. Marty joked it was broken, but she insisted it was brand new. That alone wouldn't have rattled us so much if the forest didn't simultaneously seem to get quieter the closer we got to camp. It was as though the hush from the previous night returned, pressing in on us from all sides. We could still see sunlight trickling between branches overhead, but the place felt darker, heavier. Our conversation tapered off. I noticed Liam walking faster, as if hurrying to escape something. I would have teased him for it if I hadn't felt the same urge to move faster myself. Tommy paused once, pointing to the ground. Footprints, elongated and misshapen. I immediately crouched down to get a better look, my heart thudding in my chest. They resembled human footprints but were oddly stretched. The toes were too long, the heel narrow. They didn't look like any animal prints I'd ever encountered, nor were they consistent with boots. The others hovered around, unsettled, trying to rationalize it. Maybe some weird trick of the ground or the result of someone wearing water shoes. Nobody fully believed that explanation, but we accepted it as a temporary comfort. By the time we reached the clearing, dusk had settled in, painting the sky in purples and oranges. Our tents were still there, looking almost comically cheerful against the backdrop of looming pines. We noticed, however, that the clearing seemed disturbed, as if someone or something had rummaged through our things. A few items were out of place. My small bundle of kindling was scattered around, some plastic wrappers from snacks were shredded, and a corner of Tommy's tent had mud smeared across it. Liam cursed under his breath. It could have been a raccoon or a fox, we told ourselves, but a raccoon typically leaves footprints and other evidence. We couldn't see anything definitive, and the footprints we had found earlier didn't help our nerves. We collected the scattered gear, double-checked our food was stashed properly, and decided to build a bigger fire that night for both light and warmth. We cooked a hasty dinner of canned chili and tried to talk about anything other than the day's oddities. Ava, the eternal rationalist, said we should keep calm and maybe store our food in the trees to deter animals. Marty tried to crack jokes, but they fell flat in the oppressive silence. Tommy brought up something from local lore, about stories of ghostly children wandering these woods at night, echoes of a tragedy from centuries ago, but I made him stop. My nerves couldn't handle it. He obliged, apologizing for being morbid. We huddled closer around the fire as the night deepened, the darkness around us so absolute that it felt like a living thing pressing up against the edge of the flames. No stars were visible. Clouds had rolled in, blocking the sky. At some point, Liam tensed, shining his flashlight between the tree trunks. He said he saw a tall, pale figure gliding past. We all followed the beam, but it revealed only motionless trees. Tommy's face was pale, and he looked down at the ground, muttering that it might be one of those Wendigo-like spirits from the stories. Marty told him he was being paranoid, but there was no conviction in his voice. I remember the crackle of the fire being the only real sound. After a long silence, we decided to go into our tents. The night felt far more sinister than the previous one. I couldn't calm my racing heart. The mere act of trying to fall asleep felt like a dangerous surrender. I clutched my journal, scribbling down every detail that came to mind. Footprints, the hush in the forest, the rummaged campsite, Liam's glimpse of a figure. Like if I documented it thoroughly enough, I could contain it. It was well past midnight when I finally dozed off. I'm not sure how much time passed before something dragged me from a nightmare into a more frightening reality. At first, I couldn't quite place what woke me. Then I heard it, scratching. A light, deliberate scraping against the nylon of our tent. Not frantic like an animal pawing, but slow and methodical, like fingers testing the material. My body turned to ice. I mouthed Ava's name and nudged her. Her eyes fluttered open, and in the weak glow of our dying lantern, I could see the alarm spread across her face as she heard it too. We held our breath. There was a soft rustling outside, then a low growling sound that I had never heard before, equal parts animalistic and disturbingly human. Ava reached over to grab a small pocket knife she kept by her side. I thought I heard footsteps circling the tent. Then Liam's voice, shouting from the neighboring tent, broke the silence. "Hey, who's out there?" He sounded angry, though I detected a wavering edge in his tone. Suddenly there was a scramble, like something was darting away. Moments later, Liam unzipped his tent and stumbled out with a flashlight, shining it in every direction. I quickly followed, with Ava at my side. The clearing was bathed in ghostly flashlight beams from all five of us, illuminating the silhouettes of pine trees and the threads of light mist swirling around our ankles. There was no sign of whatever had scratched our tent, but the tension in the air was palpable, so thick it was almost choking. I noticed then that some of our supply bags were strewn about again. Packages had been torn, half-eaten trail mix scattered in the dirt. Tommy swallowed hard, shining his flashlight on the ground. Those elongated footprints were back, weaving a circle around our campsite. They were clearer this time, as if made by wet feet pressing into the damp earth. Nobody spoke for a moment. The fear in that clearing was raw and unmasked. Liam eventually snapped out of it and insisted we gather everything important and take stock, all of us staying within view of one another. We grouped close, our breath visible in the chill night air. The forest around us was silent once again, as if whatever had come was now gone, though we had no way of knowing if it lurked just out of sight. We spent the rest of the night around the campfire, stoking it to keep the flames high and bright. Nobody wanted to go back inside the tents. I tried to rationalize what we had seen, some local vagrant or perhaps an unusually large animal, but the footprints defied logic. The scratching, that growl, it was not anything I recognized. Eventually dawn arrived in a slow gray light that revealed tired, anxious faces. None of us had really slept. and we all looked haunted. Over a breakfast of hurriedly made oatmeal, we debated our next move. Ava said we should pack up and leave. Tommy agreed, clearly shaken. He talked about Native American lore, about how certain areas in the Upper Peninsula are said to be cursed or guarded by spirits. Liam, still clinging to his adventurous streak, argued that leaving now might be an overreaction. Besides, we'd come all this way. A compromise emerged. We'd stay one more night, but we'd move our camp to a spot closer to the main trail, somewhere with more foot traffic, and see if that eased our minds. So we packed everything, leaving the eerie clearing behind. The feeling of relief I expected to feel as we walked away never quite came. It felt like we were being watched, but no matter how many times I spun around with my camera at the ready, I saw only the same dense trees. The day was gloomier than the one before. The forecast had mentioned possible rain, and the sky was indeed layered with heavy clouds. We followed a marked path for a few hours, occasionally crossing paths with other hikers. Just before midday, we found a more established camping area with a designated fire ring and a more open area. We even spotted a ranger's notice pinned to a nearby tree, reminding hikers of leave no trace principles. It felt safer and more normal. We set up our tents with more confidence. Marty finally cracked a real smile, joking that his comedic skills had gone underused in all this panic. He tried to lighten the mood by entertaining us with an impression of a ghost rising out of the undergrowth. We laughed, though it felt forced, like we were trying to chase away the darkness from our minds. With the tents in place, we spent the afternoon gathering firewood, triple-checking that we stored our food properly in a metal bear box provided near the trailhead. Ava and I took a short walk to a scenic overlook, hoping to see more of Lake Superior, which we glimpsed through the canopy. The lake stretched out like a steel-gray sheet under the cloudy sky, eerily beautiful. The wind was strong, carrying a damp chill. We both shivered, hugging our jackets close. Ava admitted that she couldn't shake a feeling of dread, like the events of the night before had wormed their way under her skin. I could only nod in agreement. That evening, the five of us sat around the fire, forced cheer in our voices as we made s'mores and tried to talk about anything but footprints and whispers. Tommy's anxiety flared again when the conversation inevitably circled back to the previous night. He reminded us that many indigenous stories mention malevolent spirits or wendigos dwelling in the cold north forests, especially in times of famine or strife. I'd read some of those stories too, but I never expected to come face to face with anything that resembled them. Liam insisted we should keep calm, that there was probably a normal explanation. A large animal, a local troublemaker, or even a series of coincidences that we interpreted as supernatural. In the firelight, though, I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The night wore on, and we huddled closer together, telling ourselves that we were in a far more public camping spot. At some point, a light drizzle began to fall, a gentle pattering that forced us into our tents earlier than expected. The fire sputtered and died under the moisture, leaving us with only the glow of a small lantern. I settled into my sleeping bag, hoping exhaustion would override my anxiety. Perhaps I dozed off for a moment, but I was soon awakened by a muffled sobbing sound. My heart hammered. I realized it was coming from outside, near the trees. It sounded like a child crying softly, yet the tone was off, as if played backward or through a distortion. It was heartbreakingly sad, but also deeply unnatural. My stomach churned with fear. I reached over and touched Ava's arm. Her eyes were wide open. She heard it too. Then, in a flash, the sobbing was replaced by a choking sound, and then utter silence. Ava gripped my hand, and we stayed like that, trembling and listening for what felt like an eternity. I finally heard Liam unzipping his tent. He was probably going to investigate, but then Tommy's voice hissed at him to stop, that we should stay put until we figured out what we were dealing with. The quiet that followed was suffocating. I thought about the rumored ghostly children, about tragedies that might have taken place in these woods. 1,000 possibilities raced through my mind, none comforting. There was a faint rustling outside, and I silently begged whatever it was to go away. Eventually, the rustling faded, leaving us uncertain and petrified. We emerged in the first light of dawn, each of us stiff from tension and lack of sleep. No footprints this time, but something was off about the perimeter of our camp. It was as if the boundary between the trees and our tents had been carefully disturbed. Every twig and leaf looked freshly overturned, a ring of disruption around us. I can't convey how frightening that was. It was like someone or something had walked the entire circle around our tents in the night, carefully examining us. Tommy kept shaking his head, as if trying to dislodge a bad dream. Liam, perhaps feeling responsible for getting us into this trip, suggested that we pack up immediately and head back to the nearest town. Ava agreed, not needing further persuasion. Marty, who usually never lost his cool, was uncharacteristically quiet, his face drained of color. As for me, I was silently relieved. The place was beautiful, but it was taking on a sinister quality I couldn't rationalize away. The idea of returning to a warm motel in Munising and rethinking our itinerary sounded like salvation. We quickly stuffed our gear into our packs, not bothering to fold things neatly. We started down the trail, the sky still gray and threatening more rain. The forest seemed to have a different quality in the morning light, though not necessarily friendlier. The temperature was dropping, and a chill wind occasionally rushed through the trees, making them sway and groan. We followed the path carefully, but a gnawing feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. The normally well-marked trail began to feel maze-like. At one point, we reached a fork that none of us remembered seeing before, not even the day prior when we had come this way. Ava took out the compass again, but it was spinning sporadically. She slapped it against her palm, cursing under her breath. The sense of being watched returned, more insistent than ever. We pressed on, choosing whichever path seemed most beaten down, praying it would lead us out. Our nerves were frayed, tempers quick to flare. Liam and Ava argued about the map. Marty snapped at Tommy for bringing up more legends at a time like this. I tried to tune it all out, focusing on the pattern of pine needles under my boots. The wind picked up, howling through the branches, and I almost thought I heard voices in it again. That same eerie, wordless whisper. The day wore on, and our progress felt minimal. The sky never fully brightened. We decided to take a short break in a relatively open patch of forest, mostly to gather ourselves and see if we could make sense of the map. That's when we heard the laughter. It echoed from somewhere to our left, a harsh, mocking cackle that was gone almost as soon as it began. We all froze, hearts in our throats. Liam called out a shaky, "Hello?" but got no response. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, as if on cue, a figure flickered between the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated in the same unnatural way as those footprints we had seen. I could make out pale skin, almost colorless, and eyes that seemed to reflect the weak daylight. My mind had trouble accepting what I was seeing. It stepped behind a trunk and was gone. We stood rooted in place, each of us scanning the tree line, but it didn't reappear. Instead, I began to notice more subtle movements in my peripheral vision, shapes flitting behind branches. Panic set in. Marty raised his voice, his usual comedic charm replaced by pure terror, urging us to keep moving. We stumbled forward, not really caring if we stuck to the trail, just wanting to put distance between ourselves and whatever lurked behind us. The forest grew thicker, the undergrowth more tangled. Rain started in earnest, large drops pelting us and turning the earth slick. We slid on wet leaves and muddy ground, branches lashing at our jackets and backpacks. Our plan to reach the road or town seemed like a fading hope. The wind whipped the rain sideways, stinging our faces. Then, as if some final cruelty, we glimpsed Lake Superior through the trees, battered by the storm, its waters dark and churning. We had come too far north, or too far east, or perhaps we'd circled back again. None of us knew. All I knew was that it felt like the forest was funneling us to the shoreline, whether we liked it or not. We finally stumbled out into a small clearing near the lake, battered by wind. The storm clouds were so thick that it felt like dusk, even though it was midday. The waves crashed against a rocky shore just beyond the tree line. We were soaked, exhausted, and trembling with fear. The sense of being hunted, of not being alone, was suffocating. We huddled together under a cluster of pines for some shelter, hearts pounding. Liam said maybe we should make a stand, build a fire if possible, and wait for the storm to ease up. We were in no shape to keep wandering aimlessly. Ava grimly agreed, though I could see how scared she was. Tommy looked like he was in shock. Marty's hands were shaking so badly he had trouble unzipping his pack. We gathered whatever dry wood we could find under the pines, forming a small pile. We used a bit of lighter fluid to coax it into a flame. The fire struggled in the wind but eventually took hold, casting flickering light on our faces. We erected a flimsy tarp overhead, tying it between branches to shield the flame from the worst of the rain. As we huddled there, I found myself looking out at the roiling lake, thinking about all the shipwrecks rumored to lurk beneath those waters. The Great Lakes have a history of tragedies. and in my fatigued, frightened state, it felt like all that sorrow was seeping into the air around us. Then we saw them, more than one, stepping out from the line of trees at the far edge of the clearing. Pale, elongated figures, some hunched, some impossibly tall, their limbs contorted in ways that defied nature. The firelight threw their features into sharp relief, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes reflecting a dull glow. We didn't speak. We could barely breathe. They made no sound as they advanced slowly, like predators testing the boundaries of prey. My mind raced, trying to recall everything Tommy had said about Wendigos, skinwalkers, or spirits. Were these even the same things? Or something else entirely, older than any legend we knew? Liam shouted for them to stay back, brandishing a burning branch. One of the figures stopped, tilting its head in a grotesque imitation of curiosity. My pulse pounded in my ears so fiercely I thought I might pass out. I realized, with a dizzying sense of horror, that their movement was not a normal walk. They seemed to glide or shuffle, their feet barely touching the ground. Rain fell around them, yet they moved without any seeming discomfort. Then a guttural sound rose from one of the forms, a low droning moan that made my stomach twist. It was joined by a second, then a third, until we were surrounded by this unearthly chorus. The moaning rose and fell, almost chanting, as though some ancient language was being spoken through rotted throats. In my mind, I could sense echoes of tragedy, pain, and hunger reverberating in that sound. They didn't speak in a language we recognized, but their presence screamed of a tortured history. I remembered the rumors of cursed lands, of pioneer families lost in these woods, of native tribes who had warned about malevolent spirits. It was all blending together in a nightmare we couldn't wake from. Tommy was near tears, whispering something about them wanting us to become part of the land's sorrow. I couldn't even muster a response. The fire crackled between us and them, a feeble barrier in the grand scheme of things, but maybe the only thing keeping them at bay. Time stretched interminably as they encircled our small camp. I kept waiting for them to lunge, to tear us apart, but they just prowled the perimeter, letting out those eerie moans. Liam, arms shaking, held the burning branch high, as if to challenge them. At one point, one of the creatures stepped closer, into the flickering light. I got a better look at its face. Hollow cheeks, something like a nose but twisted, and lips that seemed peeled back to reveal a row of blackened teeth. Its eyes were the worst part, void of life, yet reflecting a faint glimmer of the firelight. It opened its mouth, emitting that same haunting moan. My insides clenched, and I forced myself to look away. We realized we had to do something before night fell completely. The storm was already making visibility poor, and we could barely keep the fire alive. Ava mentioned that if we ran, we'd be easy prey in the dark, but staying put felt like a slow death. The group fell into a desperate hush. Finally, Liam, in a wavering voice, suggested that we fight to keep the fire going until the storm passed, or until morning if it came to that. The creatures seemed wary of the flame. It might give us a chance to survive. There was no good plan beyond that, just grim determination. We fed the fire with every scrap of dry wood we could find under the tarp, fueling the flames into a raging pillar of light. Smoke mingled with the rain, choking us, but also forming a protective veil. The creatures stalked closer, then retreated, as if testing the reach of the blaze. Hours passed in a surreal dance of fear. The chanting moans rose and fell, echoing off the trees and the waves. My clothes clung to my skin, my eyes stung with smoke, but I refused to let exhaustion overtake me. Every few minutes I would check on my friends. Marty was hunched on the ground, eyes wide, hugging his knees to his chest. Tommy muttered inaudible prayers, lips quivering. Ava's face was set in a mask of grim determination, though tears stained her cheeks. Liam kept moving around the fire, stoking it, a wild look in his eyes. Every time a creature ventured too close, he'd swing a torch or brand at it, driving it back into the shadows. The rain eventually died down to a light drizzle, but the gray sky overhead remained steadfast, denying us the sun's comfort. It was well past what should have been dusk, yet the stormy gloom made it impossible to tell the exact time. The creatures continued their vigil, never rushing in, never leaving. The dread in my stomach was a physical weight, and I fought the urge to collapse from emotional and physical exhaustion. At some point, maybe near midnight, the moaning quieted. I blinked, startled by the sudden hush. The figures had begun to move away, almost drifting back into the tree line. We watched, hardly daring to believe it. One by one, they receded into the darkness, until only the faint shapes of trees swayed in the wind. The clearing felt empty, but still ominous, as though they lingered just out of sight. We didn't dare sleep. We kept the fire blazing, our circle of light in a sea of shadows. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at our minds, and we nodded off in shifts. I volunteered for the first watch, forcing my eyes to stay open. During that time, I reflected on the glimpses of these creatures, on the strange histories that Tommy had alluded to. Perhaps their very existence was a testament to the land's scars, the haunting moans, the mimicry of voices, the horrifying twisted bodies. Maybe it all spoke of a deeper truth, that the tragedies and pain endured here over the centuries never left. They became something else, something that thrived in the dark recesses of these ancient forests. I woke to a pale, wintry light that signaled dawn. The storm had eased into a soft drizzle. My body ached all over, and I realized I must have dozed off for a while. The others were stirring too. We were all alive. The fire was now embers, smoking in the damp morning air. That day, the forest looked almost normal in the watery daylight, yet the memory of the night refused to dissipate. We wasted no time. We doused the embers, gathered our soaked belongings, and started moving along the shoreline in the hopes of finding a known trail or a ranger station. The creatures had disappeared, leaving behind only a creeping sense of dread. Hours of weary trekking later, we finally stumbled upon a more familiar path that led us back to the relative safety of civilization. When we reached the outskirts of Munising, we were a sorry sight. Mud-splattered, eyes hollow, nerves frayed to the breaking point. We found a small motel and collapsed into rooms. The comfort of a bed, a roof, and functioning locks was almost too much to process. We stayed there for a night, barely speaking. Each of us was lost in our own swirling thoughts and nightmares. By the following afternoon, we quietly decided to head home. Liam didn't protest this time. Nobody wanted to linger any longer in the Upper Peninsula, for fear that night would bring more horrors. We loaded up the SUV and drove away, the tangy smell of pine and damp earth still clinging to our clothes. The drive back was mostly silent, interrupted occasionally by Marty's half-hearted attempts to lighten the mood. But the mood refused to lift. Something fundamental had shifted in us. An innocence gone, or perhaps a willful ignorance about the boundaries of what could or could not exist in the woods. When I got home, I spent days simply trying to feel safe again. Normal life felt both comforting and alien. I looked at my journal, at the pages of frantic sketches and scribbled notes, and I questioned whether I should burn it or keep it as a reminder. In the end, I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. It was proof, at least to me, that something beyond my understanding lurked up there by Lake Superior. Whenever I flip through those pages, I recall the hush of the forest at night, the scratching on the tent, the elongated footprints, and the pale figures with eyes that reflected a terrible knowledge. Their chanting moans still echo in my nightmares sometimes. I wonder if they continue to roam, waiting for the unsuspecting, or if, in some perverse way, they were warning us away from land soaked in sorrow. The others dealt with the aftermath in their own ways. Liam threw himself into work, traveling even more, perhaps to outrun his memories. Ava sought therapy, admitting she couldn't shake the crippling fear whenever she closed her eyes. Marty tried to downplay it, turning it into a macabre anecdote for get-togethers. But in private, he was less jovial than before. Tommy became even more withdrawn, studying all the folklore he could find about spirits, wendigos, and curses. He believed that we had come into contact with something primal, maybe a manifestation of ancient trauma. I didn't know what to believe, only that something out there in those northern woods had looked into our eyes and recognized our fear. In my darkest moments, I wonder if we're truly safe. The bond we share from that night is a silent pact that we don't speak about often, but that always weighs heavily on us. Sometimes I think I can hear the forest calling in the distance, a whisper in the wind that reminds me I left a piece of myself up there. I try to dismiss it, to focus on my day-to-day life. Yet there's a part of me that's certain I'll never be the same. How could I be after the hush of the trees and the reflection in those pale eyes? I can still see the rolling waves of Lake Superior in my mind's eye, still feel the sting of that cold wind on my cheeks and the dread crawling up my spine as I realized there was no easy escape. I haven't returned to Pictured Rocks since, and I doubt I ever will. Sometimes late at night I wonder if I should try, if confronting whatever lurks there is the only way to reclaim some sense of peace. Then I remember the chanting moans and the twisted silhouettes, and I know I can't. Perhaps I was lucky to leave it all. Maybe the land let us go, but only after leaving a permanent mark on our souls. I still keep a small photograph I took just before all hell broke loose. It's of the forest in the fading light, tall pines reaching for the sky. Nothing overtly menacing, but if you look closely, there's a hint of something pale in the corner, a shape that might be a tree trunk, or maybe something else. It reminds me that some places harbor more than scenic beauty or restful solitude. They hold secrets that can stretch back centuries, secrets that can coil around you in the dead of night and leave you forever changed. I try not to stare at that photo for too long. I don't want to remember how vulnerable I felt. But I also don't want to forget, because forgetting might be even more dangerous, as though ignoring what's out there would invite it to visit me again in the unguarded hours of the night. And so, life goes on, haunted by fleeting shadows and half-heard whispers. We share the earth with all manner of mysteries, some benign, some indifferent, and some, I believe, deeply malevolent. The forest around Pictured Rocks doesn't care about human boundaries or the illusions we craft to keep ourselves feeling safe. It is ancient, vast, and shaped by its own history of sorrow and violence. Whatever we saw out there, or whatever saw us, it remains a warning etched in our minds. Sometimes I dream of pale shapes shifting in the corners of my vision, or I wake drenched in sweat, convinced I hear the chanting moan echoing through my bedroom window. In those moments, I remind myself that I survived once, but the land remembers. If I ever make the mistake of returning, I'm not sure it will let me leave again.